Sometimes life has a way of turning the tables in the most unexpected fashion, and when it happens, it feels almost like justice writes its own story. So picture this: a crowded downtown restaurant on a Friday night. Waiters hustling. Between tables, the chatter of customers mixing with the sound of plates and cutlery clinking, and there in the middle of all this was a young woman named Aisha. She was hardworking, polite, and sharp, the kind of waitress who remembered every customer's order without writing it down, who smiled even when her feet ached, and who knew that each shift was not just about surviving, but about carving a future for herself. But not everyone in that restaurant saw her brilliance. The man who ran the floor, a manager named Richard, carried a kind of arrogance that fed on belittling others. He had power. At least he thought he did, and power in the wrong hands is always dangerous. That night, his words cut through the air in a way that made every pair of eyes freeze and every ear in the restaurant burn. He mocked Aisha not just for spilling a drink by accident, but for the color of her skin, as if the mistake was tied to who she was, not what had happened. The insult wasn't subtle. It was loud, sharp, and dripping with condescension. "Typical," he had sneered, his voice carrying across the room. "Lazy and careless. You people never get it right." For a moment, the restaurant went silent. The way silence sometimes slams down like a hammer after thunder. Aisha stood there, her tray shaking in her hand, but not because she was weak. No, she was steadying herself, swallowing a firestorm of emotions. Customers shifted uncomfortably. A few whispered, but no one spoke up against the manager. That was the world Aisha knew too well, a place where her dignity could be tossed aside as if it were disposable, while the offender walked on smugly without fear of consequences. Yet what Richard didn't know, and what nobody in that room could have guessed, was that fate had already set the stage for a reversal so stunning, so poetic, that the memory of his insult would soon be dwarfed by the shock of who would walk through those same restaurant doors the very next morning. Aisha didn't cry that night, though the weight of humiliation pressed on her chest like an anchor. Instead, she went home with her head held high, whispering to herself that one day she would rise above it all. She didn't know that one day meant less than 24 hours away. The next morning came with a kind of quiet electricity in the air, the kind that whispers that something unusual is about to unfold. Richard, the manager, arrived at the restaurant with the same swagger he always carried, the smug grin of a man who believed his position gave him the right to trample on others. He strutted in, barking orders at the morning crew, complaining about the setup, criticizing the coffee's strength as though the world revolved around his palate. He didn't notice how some of the employees still carried the weight of last night's ugliness in their eyes, how they looked at Aisha with a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Aisha herself wasn't there yet, and Richard thought perhaps she had decided to quit after the humiliation. In his mind, it would have been just another example of what he assumed about people like her: weak, unable to handle pressure. But then, just as the morning rush began to stir, the glass doors swung open, and in walked Aisha, not in her apron, not with a tray in her hands, but in a crisp suit that seemed to radiate authority. Every head turned, every conversation hushed, and the sound of her heels against the tiled floor echoed like a drum roll before a big reveal. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time in a long time. He blinked, rubbed his eyes almost comically, and then chuckled nervously as if trying to convince himself he wasn't seeing what he was seeing. But there she was, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove anymore. The owner of the restaurant had retired a week earlier, something Richard knew, but what he didn't know was who the board had appointed as the new general manager to oversee operations. And now it was undeniable. The very woman he had mocked, insulted, and degraded was the one standing before him with the authority to control not only the restaurant, but also his own fate. The color drained from his face as she approached, her eyes steady, her chin lifted, and though she carried no anger in her expression, there was a fire of dignity that made everyone straighten in their seats. She didn't rush to speak. Instead, she let the silence stretch, the weight of irony filling every corner of the room. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, even melodic, but it carried a steel edge sharper than any blade. "Good morning, team," she said, her eyes sweeping over the staff before landing squarely on Richard. "I look forward to working with each of you to make this place better than it has ever been." The staff exchanged wide-eyed glances, some biting back grins, others covering their mouths to hide their disbelief. Richard tried to laugh, tried to brush it off as a prank, but when she pulled out the official document signed by the board, the seal shining in the sunlight pouring through the window, the reality hit him like a freight train. Aisha was his boss now. The room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and Richard felt a sweat he couldn't wipe away soaking into his collar. The man who had weaponized power against the powerless had just found himself standing in front of the very person he once demeaned, now elevated to a position where she could either show him mercy or let him taste the bitter medicine of his own cruelty. For a few seconds, Richard stood frozen in place, his jaw tightening as if clenching his teeth would somehow hold together the pieces of his collapsing ego. The staff avoided eye contact with him, some glancing down at their shoes to hide the smirks tugging at their lips, others stealing glances at Aisha with something close to admiration. It wasn't every day they saw a reversal of power so swift, so complete, and so poetic. Aisha let the silence work its way through the room before she moved again. She walked slowly toward the counter, set down her bag, and pulled out a sleek laptop, placing it on the surface as if to anchor herself firmly in her new role. She looked at Richard once more, her expression calm but unreadable. "I'll need you to prepare the shift reports from last week, Richard," she said, her tone steady, almost businesslike, as though nothing unusual had happened. It was such a simple request, but the way she said it made Richard's throat tighten. For years, he had been the one giving out orders, treating others like disposable pieces in his little empire. Now, the power dynamic had shifted so completely that he barely recognized the room he had once ruled with arrogance. His first instinct was to argue, to push back, to reassert himself. But the weight of the signed documents in her hand had silenced his pride. He stammered something about being busy with the morning setup, but she cut him off gently. "I know you've always been busy, Richard," she said softly, almost with a smile. "But I believe this time you'll find a way to make it work." The room practically vibrated with restrained laughter from the staff, though none dared to let it slip. Richard shuffled toward the back office, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller than he had ever seemed before. Aisha turned to the rest of the employees, her eyes warm now, her voice rising with sincerity. "I want to be clear with everyone here," she said. "This place has potential, but it will only grow if we treat each other with respect. I've been in your shoes. I know what it feels like to be dismissed, overlooked, and belittled. That ends today. We will build something better together." A ripple of relief and pride spread across the faces of the workers. Some nodded eagerly, others whispered excitedly among themselves. For the first time in a long while, hope filled the room like fresh air sweeping through a stuffy, closed-off space. But as inspiring as the moment was, it was only the beginning. Richard's eyes burned with a quiet resentment as he retreated, and though he felt humiliated, there was a part of him still scheming, still unwilling to accept the new order of things. And Aisha, though she wore a composed smile, knew that her greatest challenge wasn't in claiming the title of manager, it was in proving to everyone, including her enemies, that she was strong enough to lead with both firmness and grace. What no one knew yet was how far Richard would go to protect his pride, and how Aisha's resilience would be tested in ways that made last night's insult seem like nothing more than a shallow scratch compared to the storm that was coming. The rest of that day felt almost surreal to the employees, like they were living through a scene scripted for a movie rather than their own lives. Customers came and went, some of them regulars who noticed the subtle but undeniable change in the air. Aisha walked the floor with authority, but also with a warmth that invited conversation. She checked in on tables, complimented the chef, and even pitched in to help when a new server fumbled with an order. Her presence was magnetic, calm, but commanding, the kind of leadership that made people want to rise to the occasion rather than fear punishment. Yet, behind the counter and tucked away in the corners, Richard's glare lingered like a shadow that refused to vanish. He moved stiffly, his usual sharp tongue dulled into silence, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging inside him. This was a man who had built his identity around control, and now that control had been stripped away overnight. The humiliation ate at him like rust on steel, corroding whatever composure he tried to maintain. At lunch, when the rush slowed down, he slipped into the back office, slamming the door harder than necessary. Alone, he paced the floor, muttering, under his breath about how unfair it all was, how ridiculous it seemed that someone he had once managed now had the power to dictate his every move. He thought about quitting, about storming out and showing them he didn't need this place, but pride anchored him to the chair he collapsed into. If he left now, he would confirm what the staff already suspected, that he was nothing without the position he had once lorded over them. He couldn't bear to give them that satisfaction. At the same time, staying meant swallowing a humiliation that burned hotter with every passing minute. Meanwhile, Aisha wasn't naive. She knew that. Richard's silence wasn't submission, it was a dangerous quiet, the kind that precedes a desperate move. She could feel the tension whenever their paths crossed, the flicker of his eyes, the clench of his jaw, the way his hands balled into fists at his sides before he forced them open again. But she refused to let his bitterness dictate her actions. That evening, when the last customers trickled out and the floor needed cleaning, she rolled up her sleeves and joined the staff in wiping tables, stacking chairs, and sweeping the floor. It wasn't about proving anything. It was simply who she was. The staff watched her in awe. Never had a manager worked alongside them like an equal. Richard, standing off to the side with a broom he barely moved, felt his resentment twist tighter. To him, her humility wasn't admirable. It was infuriating, a reminder that she was winning over the people who had once looked to him for direction. And in that gnawing frustration, a seed of spite began to sprout, one that whispered dangerous ideas into his thoughts. The more the staff admired Aisha, the more invisible he felt, and invisibility was something his ego could not survive. That night, long after the restaurant had closed and the staff had gone home, Richard sat alone in the dimly lit office, staring at the spreadsheets glowing on the computer screen, but not really seeing them. His mind spun like a wheel stuck in mud, churning over the same bitter thoughts again and again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Aisha standing at the front of the restaurant in her tailored suit, her calm authority radiating like sunlight that exposed every crack in his ego. He thought of the way the staff had looked at her, with respect, with hope, with something close to admiration, and he realized that they had never looked at him like that. Not once in all his years of shouting, belittling, and flexing his authority had he inspired loyalty. At best, he had inspired fear, and now even that was gone. Fear couldn't survive in the presence of someone who offered respect in its place. His fists clenched on the desk, knuckles whitening as anger boiled beneath his skin. He told himself he had been wronged, that this was some twisted joke of fate, that he deserved to be in charge, not her. But beneath that anger, if he had dared to dig deep enough, there was something else eating away at him. Shame. The insult he had thrown at her wasn't just cruel. It had revealed the ugliest part of himself to everyone in the room. And now, with her above him, that ugliness felt like a brand on his forehead, visible to all. But instead of confronting that shame, he fed his resentment, convincing himself that she had somehow orchestrated all of this to humiliate him. As the hours passed and the clock ticked past midnight, he began drafting an email on the company system, a venomous complaint accusing Aisha of being unqualified, of manipulating her way into the role, of being unfit to lead. His fingers flew over the keys, each word fueled by bitterness. But when he paused to read it back, the letter sounded hollow even to him. He deleted it in frustration, slamming the keyboard until the keys rattled. The truth gnawed at him. There was nothing he could write, nothing he could prove, that would undo the reality of her appointment. Meanwhile, across town, Aisha sat at her small kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp lighting the papers she had spread out before her. They weren't restaurant documents, but personal notes. Reflections she had written years ago when she had first started working there. Lists of goals, affirmations, reminders to herself that she was worth more than the way she was treated. Now, as she looked at them, she felt a quiet sense of triumph, but also a heavy responsibility. This wasn't just about proving herself. It was about setting a standard for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed. She knew Richard's hostility wasn't gone. It lingered in every glance he gave her, every stiff movement when she passed by. But she also knew that the best revenge wasn't retaliation. It was transformation. If she could take the restaurant and turn it into a place where dignity and respect flourished, then his cruelty would have no place to breathe. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered a promise to herself. Tomorrow, I begin not just as their boss, but as their ally. Little did she know that Richard, at that very same hour, was whispering his own vow, one carved not from hope, but from spite. I'll make sure you regret this. The next few days unfolded like a quiet battlefield, the kind where every glance, every word, every gesture carried the weight of unspoken tension. Aisha worked tirelessly, arriving early, checking in with the kitchen, reviewing supply orders, and even speaking with long-time customers to learn what could make their experience better. Her energy was contagious. The servers began smiling more, the cooks joked in the kitchen again, and even the atmosphere in the dining hall felt lighter. The staff noticed small changes too, new break schedules that gave them breathing room, fairer distribution of shifts, and a clear effort from Aisha to make sure nobody felt invisible. Morale was rising, and with it, productivity. But as the restaurant's heartbeat grew stronger, Richard's resentment grew darker. He walked the floor with a tight jaw, muttering criticisms under his breath, sometimes loud enough for only the nearest ears to catch. He made subtle digs, suggesting to newer staff that Aisha was soft and that her kindness would only make the place weak. To him, leadership meant fear, and he couldn't understand how respect could hold the same weight. But his whispers began to sound desperate, especially as more of the staff openly gravitated toward Aisha. One afternoon, during the lunch rush, Richard deliberately mishandled a customer's order, then tried to pin the mistake on a young server who had only been there 2 weeks. The server's face turned pale with fear, but before the lie could take root, Aisha stepped forward, calm but firm. "That's not true, Richard," she said evenly, her eyes fixed on him. "I saw you handle that ticket yourself." The room seemed to hold its breath, customers and staff alike pausing to watch the standoff. Richard's face flushed crimson, his lips parting as if to argue, but the evidence against him was undeniable. He stormed off toward the kitchen, slamming the swinging door so hard it rattled on its hinges. Later that day, Aisha called him into the office. She didn't raise her voice, didn't let her frustration show. Instead, she laid out the expectations. with the kind of clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "You are part of this team," she told him, her tone measured. "But if you undermine the people here, you're not just hurting them, you're hurting this restaurant. That won't be tolerated anymore." Her words were direct, but what shook Richard more was the way she looked at him, not with hatred, not even with satisfaction, but with a sort of steady disappointment that made him feel smaller than any insult ever could. He left the office with his fists stuffed into his pockets, his anger threatening to spill over. Every attempt he made to sabotage her had backfired, and the staff's loyalty was slipping further from his grasp. Yet, in his twisted pride, he refused to admit defeat. Instead, he began to plot something bigger, something that would not just embarrass Aisha, but, in his mind, expose her as a fraud. The seed of that plan sprouted in silence, and though Aisha sensed the danger in his restless movements and hollow stares, she kept her focus forward, unaware that Richard was preparing for a move that could shake not just the restaurant, but her own spirit. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday night, the busiest shift of the week. The restaurant was buzzing with life, every table full, the kitchen a symphony of clattering pans and sizzling orders, waiters weaving between chairs with practiced rhythm. It was the kind of night that tested every crack in the system, and Richard saw it as his perfect opportunity. He had spent the previous days quietly stirring discontent, whispering to anyone who would listen that Aisha's changes would eventually collapse under pressure. He told the kitchen staff she was too inexperienced, hinted to servers that she didn't know how to handle a rush, and even made a few calls to friends, inviting them to dine that night with the intention of creating trouble. When the dinner crowd reached its peak, he slipped into the back, deliberately misplacing key orders and switching table tickets. Within minutes, chaos began to ripple. Dishes went to the wrong customers, a steak meant medium rare arrived burnt, and a family waiting for appetizers hadn't seen food in nearly 40 minutes. The tension thickened, and some customers began raising their voices, calling for the manager. Richard, feigning innocence, stepped back and waited for Aisha to crumble under the weight of the disaster. But instead of panicking, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and moved with a calmness that surprised even the staff. She apologized sincerely to the customers, comped a few meals without hesitation, and then called the staff together in the corner of the dining room. "Listen," she said firmly, her voice rising above the noise. "We're going to fix this. Right now, together. No blame, no excuses, just solutions." Something about the steadiness in her voice cut through the chaos, and the staff rallied behind her. She reassigned roles on the spot, jumped in to help in the kitchen, and within 20 minutes, the storm had settled into order again. Customers, instead of storming out, were nodding in appreciation, some even clapping softly at the way she had handled the crisis. Richard watched from the shadows, his plan collapsing before his eyes. When Aisha finally turned to him, she didn't shout or accuse. She simply said, loud enough for staff and customers alike to hear, "In this place, we rise by lifting each other up. Anyone who tears others down has no place here." The weight of her words fell like a hammer. The staff knew exactly who she meant, and the owner, who had come in quietly that night to see how the new manager was doing, had heard everything. Within hours, Richard was called into the office and handed his termination papers. He left with his head low, the echo of his footsteps heavy with defeat. Aisha, meanwhile, stood at the front of the restaurant as her staff gathered around, their smiles wide, their spirits high. She had faced not only an insult, but a storm of sabotage, and turned it into a victory, not by stooping to cruelty, but by proving that true leadership comes from strength wrapped in grace. The very next morning, as sunlight spilled across the dining hall, she looked around at the team she now led and thought back to the moment when Richard's words had tried to break her. She realized then that the insult which had once stung so deeply had become the spark that lit her path. And in that quiet reflection, she smiled. not because she had defeated Richard, but because she had risen above him, and in doing so, had given everyone else permission to rise too.